In the remote hills of Montana, an elderly farmer named Samuel Wright lives in isolation after losing his wife 3 years ago. When a mysterious stranger appears at his door during a fierce winter storm, Samuel's simple act of kindness, sharing freshly baked bread and shelter, sets in motion a chain of events that will restore his faith in human connection and community. What begins as a solitary man's quiet existence transforms into a powerful testament to how small acts of compassion can ripple outward in unexpected ways. The wind howled across the Montana plains like a wounded animal, carrying with it the promise of the harshest winter in decades. Samuel Wright stood at his kitchen window, watching the snow pile against the fence posts that marked the boundary of his 100-acre farm. At 72, his weathered hands still held steady as he kneaded the evening's bread dough, the familiar rhythm serving as both meditation and muscle memory from 5 decades of farming. The kitchen felt enormous around him now. 3 years had passed since Martha's funeral, yet her presence lingered in every corner. The ceramic rooster collection on the windowsill, the faded gingham curtains she'd sewn during their first summer as newlyweds, the well-worn recipe cards scattered across the counter in her careful cursive. The house had been built for a family, for the children they'd hoped for but never had, for the grandchildren who existed only in dreams, deferred and eventually abandoned. Samuel's daily routine had crystallized into something both comforting and suffocating. Rise at 5:30, tend to the handful of cattle that remained from what had once been a thriving operation, check the chicken coop, repair whatever the previous day's weather had damaged. The bread baking had started as necessity. The nearest store was 43 miles away, and winter often made the winding mountain roads impassable for weeks. But it had evolved into something more sacred, a connection to Martha's memory and the domestic rhythms that had once given their life meaning. The dough beneath his palms was perfect, slightly tacky, but not sticky, with the faint sweetness that came from the touch of honey Martha had insisted upon. "Bread should welcome you home," she used to say, and even now Samuel could hear her voice as clearly as if she were standing beside him. The oven's warmth pushed back against the cold, seeping through the old farmhouse's single-pane windows, creating a cocoon of comfort in the growing darkness. Outside, the storm intensified. The weather service had predicted 8 to 12 inches, but Samuel's bones, reliable predictors after 7 decades of mountain winters, suggested something far worse approaching. The cattle had clustered near the barn earlier than usual, and the chickens had refused to leave their coop despite the mild afternoon temperatures. Animals knew things humans had forgotten, instincts honed by generations of survival that modern meteorology couldn't match. He shaped the loaves with practiced efficiency, 3 for the week ahead, placing them in the banneton baskets Martha had ordered from France during one of her rare indulgences. The ritual of scoring the tops with his grandfather's lame brought a familiar satisfaction. The shallow cuts that would bloom into beautiful patterns once the bread met the oven's heat. This was creation in its purest form, transforming simple ingredients into sustenance through time, temperature, and patience. As he slid the loaves into the Dutch ovens, the sound of an engine struggling against the wind caught his attention. Samuel paused, head tilted toward the window. Vehicles rarely ventured down his gravel drive, especially not in weather like this. The UPS truck made its monthly delivery on the 15th, but that had come and gone 2 weeks ago. The county road crews might check on him after a bad storm, but never during one. The engine coughed and died somewhere near his mailbox. Samuel wiped flour from his hands and peered through the frost-covered glass, but the swirling snow had reduced visibility to mere yards. Whoever had arrived was either desperate or lost, possibly both. In these mountains during weather like this, both conditions could prove fatal. Samuel pulled on his heavy coat and boots, wrapping a wool scarf around his neck before stepping onto the covered porch. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and stinging his exposed skin. Through the blizzard's white chaos, he could make out the dark outline of an old pickup truck, steam rising from under its hood in ghostly tendrils. "Hello," he called, his voice barely audible above the wind. "You need help." A figure emerged from the driver's side, hunched against the storm and moving with the careful steps of someone fighting exhaustion. As the person drew closer, Samuel could see it was a man, perhaps in his 30s, wearing a thin jacket wholly inadequate for the conditions. His dark hair was plastered to his head with melting snow, and his lips had taken on the bluish tinge that preceded hypothermia. "I'm sorry to bother you," the stranger said, teeth chattering so violently the words came out staccato. "My truck. The engine just quit. I was trying to reach Billings, but I think I took a wrong turn somewhere back on the highway. Samuel didn't hesitate. In Montana, you didn't debate whether to help a stranded traveler. You helped first and asked questions later. The arithmetic of survival in these conditions was brutally simple. Shelter meant life. Exposure meant death. "Come on inside," Samuel said, taking the man's elbow to guide him toward the house. "We'll worry about your truck once you're warm." The stranger stumbled slightly, his legs unsteady from cold and fatigue. "I don't want to impose. If you could just let me use your phone to call for a tow. Son, there won't be any tow trucks running tonight, and even if there were, they couldn't reach us till this storm passes." Samuel pushed open the front door, releasing a wave of warm, bread-scented air into the night. "Come on. My wife always said our house was too big for just the two of us anyway." Inside, the stranger stood dripping on the braided rug Martha had made from old wool coats, looking around the kitchen with the wide-eyed appreciation of someone who had glimpsed paradise after wandering in purgatory. The loaves were just finishing their bake, filling the room with the deep, yeasty aroma that spoke of comfort and home. "I'm Samuel Wright," the farmer said, extending his hand. "David Martinez," the stranger replied, his handshake firm despite the trembling. "And I can't thank you enough. I thought I might not make it through the night." Samuel studied the young man's face, noting the genuine gratitude mixed with something deeper, a weariness that spoke of troubles beyond a broken-down truck and bad weather. There were stories written in the lines around David's eyes, chapters of hardship that resonated with Samuel's own understanding of life's unexpected turns. "Let's get you some dry clothes and hot coffee," Samuel said, already moving toward the linen closet where he kept spare blankets and some of his old work shirts. "Then we'll see about getting some food in you. Nothing fancy, but it'll stick to your ribs." As David changed into the borrowed clothes, Samuel pulled the finished loaves from the oven, their crusts a perfect golden brown with the signature bloom patterns he'd been perfecting for decades. The bread would need to cool before slicing, but he had soup simmering on the back burner, a hearty vegetable and beef concoction that Martha had perfected during their leaner years. When David emerged from the bathroom, transformed from a half-frozen stranger into someone who looked almost like family in Samuel's old flannel shirt, the farmer felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't experienced in years. The house felt less empty somehow, the silence less oppressive. For the first time since Martha's death, Samuel wasn't eating dinner alone. "That bread smells incredible," David said, settling into the chair Samuel indicated at the kitchen table. "Old family recipe," Samuel replied, ladling soup into bowls. "My wife perfected it over the years. She always said bread was meant to be shared." As they ate, the storm raged outside with renewed fury, but inside the warm kitchen, two strangers began the delicate process of becoming something more. Samuel found himself sharing stories about the farm, about Martha, about the rhythms of rural life that had shaped his 7 decades. David spoke haltingly at first, then with growing confidence about his journey from California, the job he'd lost, the family he was trying to reach in Minneapolis. Neither man knew that this simple act of hospitality, one person offering bread and shelter to another during a storm, would set in motion events that would transform not just their own lives, but the entire community that surrounded Samuel's lonely farm. Sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, creating waves that reach shores we never imagined. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside, something warmer than bread was rising. Dawn arrived reluctantly through the storm clouds, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of pewter and rose. Samuel woke before his alarm, as he had every morning for 50 years, but for the first time in recent memory, the silence that greeted him wasn't absolute. From the guest room down the hall came the soft sounds of another person breathing, shifting beneath blankets existing in the space that had felt tomb-like since Martha's passing. The storm had exhausted itself sometime before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed. Through his bedroom window, Samuel could see snow drifted nearly to the fence tops, sculpted by the wind into fantastic shapes that caught the early light like frozen waves. The thermometer outside read -18 degrees, cold enough to kill an engine, cold enough to kill a man caught without proper shelter. In the kitchen, Samuel moved through his morning routine with unusual energy. Instead of the single cup of coffee that had become his standard, he filled the pot with enough for 2. The leftover soup from dinner would make a hearty breakfast, and there was still bread from yesterday's baking, now properly cooled and ready to slice. The simple act of preparing food for another person awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. David appeared in the doorway as Samuel was setting the table, his hair still rumpled from sleep, but his color much improved from the night before. The borrowed clothes hung loose on his frame, suggesting recent weight loss that spoke of harder times than a simple job search. "I hope I didn't oversleep," David said, running a hand through his dark hair. "I can't remember the last time I slept so well." "Nothing to oversleep for," Samuel replied, gesturing toward the chair David had occupied the night before. "Storm's passed, but it'll be a while before any tow trucks can get through. County won't have the roads plowed until this afternoon at the earliest." David nodded, accepting this rural reality with the resignation of someone who had learned not to fight circumstances beyond his control. "I'm grateful for another night's shelter, but I don't want to be a burden. Maybe I can help with chores, earn my keep somehow." Samuel paused in his coffee pouring, struck by something in the younger man's tone, a pride that refused to accept charity without offering something in return. It reminded him of himself at that age, fresh from the army, and determined to prove his worth on Martha's father's farm. "Well," Samuel said slowly, "the chickens still need tending, storm or no storm, and I've got some fence posts that came loose yesterday. Could use an extra pair of hands if you're offering." Relief flickered across David's features. "I'd be happy to help. It's the least I can do." They ate breakfast in comfortable companionship, the conversation flowing more easily than it had the night before. David spoke about his journey from California, the construction company that had folded, taking his job and his modest savings with it, the apartment he'd lost, the girlfriend who'd decided she couldn't handle the uncertainty, the family in Minneapolis who'd offered a fresh start if he could just get there. "Seems like life has a way of stripping everything down to the essentials," David mused, tearing off a piece of Samuel's bread. "This storm, being stranded here, maybe it's not the worst thing that could have happened." Samuel understood. After Martha's death, he'd felt similarly stripped bare, reduced to the fundamental elements of existence: shelter, sustenance, and the long days between sunrise and sunset. But where Samuel had withdrawn into solitude, David seemed to be searching for connection, for a way back into the world of human community. After breakfast, they bundled into layers of clothing and ventured outside. The cold was breathtaking in its intensity, turning their breath into crystalline clouds that hung in the still air. Samuel's boots crunched through snow that reached nearly to his knees, but he moved with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had navigated worse conditions. The chickens, predictably, were indignant about the weather, but grateful for the cracked corn and warm water Samuel provided. David watched with genuine interest as the farmer explained his routine, the careful balance of nutrition, the importance of keeping the water from freezing, the way to read the bird's behavior for signs of illness or distress. "You really know what you're doing," David observed as they moved toward the barn to check on the cattle. 50 years of practice," Samuel replied, "though I'll admit, it's gotten lonely doing it all by myself." The cattle had weathered the storm well, huddled together in the shelter Samuel had built specifically for such conditions. As they distributed hay and checked the automatic watering system, David proved himself a quick learner and willing worker. His movements had the easy coordination of someone accustomed to physical labor, and he asked thoughtful questions that showed he was genuinely absorbing what Samuel taught him. Working together, they repaired the damaged fence posts, David holding the post steady, while Samuel drove in the nails with practiced efficiency. The physical activity felt good after the long, sedentary winter months, and Samuel found himself enjoying the rhythm of shared labor in a way he hadn't expected. "You know," David said as they paused to catch their breath, "I've spent the last 6 months thinking my life was falling apart, but standing here, working with my hands, being useful, it feels like maybe things are just changing direction instead." Samuel studied the younger man's face, seeing in it something he recognized from his own youth. The moment when a person realizes that sometimes what feels like failure is actually preparation for something better. Martha used to say that life doesn't give us what we want, it gives us what we need. Usually takes a while to see the difference. They worked until noon, when the sound of diesel engines announced the arrival of the county snowplows. From the farmhouse porch, they could see the orange trucks making their slow progress down the main road, pushing aside the snow that had seemed so insurmountable at dawn. "I suppose that means I can get my truck looked at," David said, but there was something hesitant in his voice, as if he wasn't entirely eager to resume his interrupted journey. "Suppose so," Samuel agreed. "Though if you wanted to stay another day or two, make sure that engine's really fixed before you head back out into uncertain weather." "Well, there's plenty of work here to keep 2 people busy." David turned to look at him, and Samuel saw something in the younger man's eyes that he hadn't seen since Martha's death. The possibility of companionship, of shared purpose, of a house that didn't echo with emptiness. "I'd like that," David said quietly. "I'd like that very much." Neither man could have predicted that this simple decision to extend hospitality for another day, to accept help with daily chores, would soon draw the attention of people neither of them had met, people who had been watching from a distance and preparing for something Samuel couldn't yet imagine. Sometimes the most significant changes in our lives begin not with dramatic gestures, but with the quiet decision to let another person stay a little longer, to share the load a little more equally, to open our doors to possibilities we hadn't considered. The afternoon stretched ahead of them, full of ordinary tasks that felt extraordinary simply because they would be shared. And somewhere in the surrounding hills, word was already spreading about the lonely farmer who had taken in a stranger, about bread shared and kindness offered when it was needed most. The third morning dawned crisp and clear, the kind of crystalline Montana day that made the previous storm seem like a distant memory. Samuel woke to the sound of David already moving around in the kitchen, the rich aroma of coffee mingling with something else, the unmistakable scent of bread rising. He found the younger man standing over a bowl of dough, his movements tentative but determined. "I hope you don't mind," David said, looking up with a mixture of pride and uncertainty. "I watched you the other night, tried to remember what Martha's recipe card said. Figured it was time I contributed something besides just eating your food." Samuel examined the dough with the critical eye of a master baker, pressing it gently with one finger to test the proofing. "Looks perfect," he said, and meant it. Martha would be pleased to know her bread is still bringing people together. As they worked side by side preparing breakfast, Samuel noticed David moving with increasing confidence around the kitchen. The younger man had found his place in the rhythm of the household, anticipating needs and filling silences with comfortable presence rather than nervous chatter. It was a kind of domestic partnership Samuel hadn't experienced since Martha's illness had begun limiting her activities. "I've been thinking," David said as they sat down to eat. "About what comes next, I mean. My sister in Minneapolis, she's got her own family, her own problems. Maybe showing up unannounced isn't the best plan I've ever had." Samuel buttered a slice of the bread David had made, noting its excellent texture and the hint of honey that showed the young man had been paying attention to details. "Sometimes the best plans are the ones we don't make," he said. "Sometimes we just follow where the breadcrumbs lead." Before David could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention to the window. Not one truck this time, but several. A convoy of pickups and SUVs making their way down the gravel drive with the purposeful procession of people on a mission. "You expecting company?" David asked, but Samuel was already shaking his head, his weathered face creased with puzzlement. They watched from the porch as the vehicles arranged themselves in a rough semicircle around the farmhouse. Doors opened and people emerged. Men and women Samuel knew by sight if not by name, neighbors from farms scattered across the valley, some from as far as 20 miles away. There was Bill Henderson from the feed store in town, Maria Santos who ran the small grocery, the Johansson brothers from the cattle ranch to the south, and at least 15 others. But they weren't empty-handed. Pickup beds were loaded with split firewood, stacked neatly and ready for use. Toolboxes glinted in the morning sun. Several people carried casserole dishes and covered pots that spoke of meals prepared with care. And Tom Morrison, the valley's part-time preacher and full-time carpenter, stood near his truck holding something that made Samuel's breath catch in his throat. It was a wooden cross, beautifully crafted from what looked like oak, with Samuel Wright carved in elegant letters across the horizontal beam. Not a memorial cross, Samuel could see that immediately, but something else entirely. Something that spoke of recognition, of respect, of a community's acknowledgement of one of its own. Bill Henderson stepped forward, his usually gruff demeanor softened by something that might have been embarrassment at such a public display of sentiment. "Samuel," he said, his voice carrying across the snow-covered yard. "We heard about what you did, about taking in a stranger during the storm." Samuel felt David tense beside him, perhaps wondering if he was about to become the center of unwanted attention. But Bill's next words dispelled that concern. "Been too long since any of us checked on you proper," Bill continued. "Since Martha passed, we all figured you wanted to be left alone. But when word got around about you opening your door to someone in need, well, it reminded us of something we'd forgotten." Maria Santos stepped forward then, a warm smile creasing her weathered face. "My grandmother used to say that a person who shares bread with a stranger is someone who understands what community really means. We thought maybe it was time we started acting like neighbors again, instead of just people who happen to live near each other. The next hour passed in a blur of activity that transformed Samuel's quiet farm into something resembling a barn, raising from a bygone era. The men set to work stacking the gifted firewood in Samuel's depleted woodshed, while others examined his equipment and machinery with the practiced eyes of people who understood what needed fixing. The women took over his kitchen, organizing a feast that would feed everyone present with enough left over for Samuel to eat well for weeks. David found himself swept into the activity, his outsider status somehow transformed into an integral part of the story. People thanked him for being there during the storm, as if his presence had been the catalyst that reminded them all of what they'd been missing. Children who had come with their parents played in the snow, their laughter adding a soundtrack of joy to the industrious work of their elders. "We should have done this sooner," Ellen Johansson said to Samuel as she helped arrange food on his suddenly crowded kitchen table. "After Martha died, we all thought about coming by, but nobody wanted to intrude. Seems like we mistook giving you space for giving you the cold shoulder." Samuel found his voice rough with emotions he'd kept buried for 3 years. "I didn't think anybody remembered I was out here." "Oh, Samuel," she said, patting his arm with maternal authority. "We never forgot. We just forgot how to show it." As the afternoon wore on, the wooden cross was mounted on a post near Samuel's front gate, not as a religious symbol, though it certainly was that for some, but as a marker of belonging, a sign that this farm and its owner were part of something larger than themselves. Tom Morrison explained that he'd been working on it for months, ever since he'd heard about Samuel's quiet acts of generosity to various people in the valley over the years. "Turns out, you've been helping folks for a long time," Tom said. "Remember when the Martinez family lost their house in that fire 2 years ago? Food kept showing up on their doorstep, anonymous-like. Or when old Pete Garrison was in the hospital and somehow his bills got paid by a concerned friend. Funny how these things have a way of getting traced back to their source eventually." Samuel felt heat rise in his cheeks. Those had been private matters, small gestures that seemed insignificant at the time. He'd never imagined anyone was keeping track, much less that his neighbors had connected the dots. David, who had been listening to these revelations with growing amazement, looked at Samuel with new understanding. "You've been taking care of people all along, haven't you? Even when you thought you were alone." As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and crimson, the neighbors began preparing to leave. But the day's events had shifted something fundamental in the valley's social landscape. Plans were made for regular check-ins, for shared meals, for the kind of community involvement that had once been second nature, but had somehow been lost in the rush of modern life. "Same time next week?" Bill Henderson asked as he climbed into his truck. "I mean, for coffee and conversation, not the whole production," he added with a grin. Samuel nodded, his throat too tight for easy speech. Beside him, David stood with his hands thrust deep in his pockets, clearly moved by what he'd witnessed but uncertain of his place in this emerging community narrative. As the last truck disappeared down the drive, Samuel and David stood looking at the cross that now marked the entrance to the farm. In the gathering twilight, it seemed to glow with its own inner light, a beacon that spoke of connections renewed and bonds strengthened by the simple act of one person caring for another. "I guess this changes things," David said quietly. Samuel nodded, understanding that they were both talking about more than just the day's events. They were talking about the future, about possibilities neither of them had dared to imagine just a few days before.